World Economic War. Who benefits and how much time is left? And the writer says, I've been warning about an inevitable East versus West economic war for many years now. The question was never a matter of likelihood. It was always just a matter of timing. When would the most convenient time be for World War III? The issue of convenience, quote unquote, might sound odd, but I want readers to remember one rule. All wars are banker wars. There is nothing you cannot eventually understand in terms of geopolitics, as long as you accept the fact that international conflicts are generally engineered and always designed to benefit a particular group of establishment power brokers and financial elites. If you're one of those people who assumes all of these events are merely random and unfortunate coincidence, then you'll remain in the dark for the rest of your life and will never grasp why terrible things are happening to you as the world falls apart. You'll go to an early grave because you are unprepared while still thinking you were the smartest person in the room. In my article, Order Out of Chaos, How the Ukraine Conflict is Designed to Benefit Globalists, I outlined the many factors that tie the Kremlin, that is Russia, to globalist institutions like the World Economic Forum, WEF, the Bank of International Settlements, BIS, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, elitists like Henry Kissinger, and international banks like Goldman Sachs. The reality is Russia has long been attached to globalist interests, and this is not going to change because of the war in Ukraine, just as it did not change after Russia annexed Crimea. China is, of course, even worse when it comes to collusion with globalist institutions. The nation accrued trillions of dollars in debt because this is a prerequisite for joining the IMF Special Drawing Rights, SDR, basket of currencies. Yes, China went from being a nation of minimal debt to being trillions in the red just because the IMF demands liquidity for a nation's currency to be considered viable for their global centralization initiatives. This is not the behavior of a country that is anti-globalist. I'm not going to continue rehashing the facts surrounding Eastern nations and their attachment to the globalists here. I've already done that for well over a decade, and frankly, I grow tired of having to rehash the lessons that brilliant researchers like Anthony Sutton expertly addressed back before I was born. If there's a major war, then there are globalists behind it, influencing both sides, seeking to gain more power. If you haven't figured this out by now, then you never will. Here's what war is good for. Why engineer war? Simple. When you play both sides of a chess game, you always end up the winner. Beyond that, chaos is the ultimate recipe for advancing draconian agendas, and the public would never allow to pass during peacetime. What I want to examine here instead is the issue of timing and development. How is this massive economic war going to play out, and how long will it take to happen? Once we understand the stages, maybe we can brace for impact and take actions to change the outcome. The first step is to acknowledge that the ball is in the court of Eastern nations and that their actions will dictate the pace of events. The economic lesson the West has forgotten. True wealth has nothing to do with money or debt creation. True wealth comes from resources, the means of production and labor. This is something the Marxists actually got right in their philosophy. The problem is that Marxists are only interested in ways to steal labor, resources, and production, while making the public think that such theft is a good thing. Eastern nations continue to understand what real wealth is. You can have all the money in the world, but if you have no manufacturing base or resource development, then you have nothing. It's as simple as that. If a nation has no real wealth and no means of creating it, no printing press is going to save its economy. The West has abandoned much of its means of production and has crippled the exploration of its own resources through fake environmental concerns like carbon pollution. The East has not done this, at least not in a way that affects long-term productivity. Therefore, the East is in the strongest position to survive a global economic conflict. But the real key to the progression of an economic world war is a combination of countries involved and their trade agreements. Russia and China, for example, have been developing bilateral trade means meant to cut out the US dollar for many years now. Russia is resource rich and China has the world's largest manufacturing and export base. An alliance makes perfect economic sense, and that this is exactly what has happened. Only weeks before the invasion of Ukraine, Russia signed a 30-year oil and gas contract with China worth hundreds of billions of dollars. This deal coincides with the construction of a major pipeline from Russia to China, which will be completed by the year 2025. India also made arrangements for increased oil shipments from Russia and will pay without the dollar, formerly the world's sole petrol currency. Furthermore, the promise of a lower price, while the rest of the world, the oil world, is experiencing rapid inflation in energy prices. This is highly tempted for those purchasing oil, natural gas, or coal from Russia. The other nations of the BRICS bloc, Brazil, India, China, and South Africa, all have been highly active in trade with Russia, despite Western sanctions and removals of Russian banks from the SWIFT international payment network. This is exactly what I predicted would happen many years ago. But how does this trading bloc affect the time frame of the world war? An economic war has economic targets. It's been my belief that the real target of this war is not Russia or China, but the US dollar and the American economy. Yes, there will be far-reaching financial consequences beyond the US, but our economy, the US economy, is the only economy that's completely reliant on our currency's global reserve status. A world war using economic weapons and tactics is the worst type of war we could fight because it is not a war we can win. The dollar's global reserve status is our Achilles heel. It is not a strength, but it's a weakness. While all eyes are on the shooting war in Ukraine on the other side of the planet, very few realize that the worst damage is going to hit right here at home in the US. The sanctions on Russia are only part of the problem, as this is creating momentum towards the general decoupling from the dollar trade. The bigger issue is the BRICS nations and their export-import partners who will refuse to accept sanctions because they are economically dependent on each other. One example is a recent announcement by Hungary that they plan to refuse any cuts to Russian oil and gas imports. Why? Because this would cause an energy crisis in their country, one they could not recover from. Many other nations are following this logic around the world, and if NATO is going to continue pushing for economic isolation of Russia, then those countries will invariably stop using the dollar as their reserve currency. Why invariably, you might ask? Why does Russia's economic isolation lead to the end of the dollar's global reserve status? Here's why. When the Biden administration and the European Union, EU, sanctioned Russia, they also froze Russia's US dollar account and terminated Russia's connection with the international payments platform. This was a very clear method of coercion. It's as though Biden called up Putin and told him, get out of Ukraine or else. That's a real nice economy you got there. Be ashamed of something happened to it. It would be a shame if something happened to it. The rest of the world watched the West financially cancel Russia with a mix of awe and horror. This act of economic warfare revealed a nearly unthinkable conclusion. If they did it to Russia, they could do it to us too. Credit Suisse's global head of interest rate strategy, Zoltan Pozsar, told Bloomberg, odd lots show. Wars tend to turn into major junctures for global currencies, and with Russia losing access to its foreign currencies reserves, a message has been sent to all countries that they cannot count on these money stashes to actually be theirs in the event of tension. As such, it may make less and less sense for global reserve managers to hold dollars for safety, given that they could be taken away right when they're most needed. Dylan Grace of Calderwood's Capital put this in more stark terms. Never seen weaponization of money on this scale before. You only get to play the card once. China will make it a priority to need no US dollars before going to Taiwan. It's a turning point in monetary history, the end of the US dollar hegemony, and the acceleration towards a bipolar monetary order, he said. In other words, the establishment elites in the US and Europe are creating the conditions which can destroy the dollar. The dollar's status is entirely dependent on faith and belief in its demand. If demand for dollar wavers because of global sanctions, then all those trillions of greenbacks held in overseas banks will come flooding back into the US, shoving the nation deeper into stagflationary crisis. The globalists are perfectly aware that this will be the consequence, and in fact, they're counting on it. We have 8 years to prepare. In the year 2030 is consistently mentioned by the United Nations, the IMF, the WEF, and the rest of the cabal of globalist institutions as the final milestone for the Great Reset agenda. If a global economic crisis is a catalyst as it appears to be, then several years would be required to let the collapse play out, along with the introduction of a solution to the problem. This means that the economic war will have to accelerate quickly going into the next year. Today, we're already seeing 40-year highs in inflation, along with considerable supply chain disruptions. Multiple globalist foundations are predicting food shortages around the world in the next 3 to 6 months. I believe the war itself will expand rapidly within a year to include China, and most of the damage will be done by the end of the year 2024. This will all depend on how fast exporters, mainly China, dump the dollar. The dollar dump will be the primary trigger. A significant part of the WF's Great Reset agenda and the IMF's Special Drawing Rights Global Digital Currency Initiative would require the end of the dollar as a world reserve currency. This is a process the globalists have been talking about openly for some time. It's not conspiracy theory, it's a conspiracy reality. The IMF has argued on many occasions that the global currency framework must be managed by a centralized entity that can prevent national governments from exploiting currency trade for their own ends, and this includes digital currencies. The stage is already set for this narrative. The US will be painted as an example of why nationalism is a path to disaster and why no single nation should be trusted with so much power in the form of a world reserve currency. That kind of power tempts governments not only into excessive money creation, power debt financing spending sprees, not only to print new money to pay for those old debts, thus debasing and degrading the dollar's purchasing power worldwide, also known as inflation, but look at what the US did to Russia, freezing bank accounts and canceling credit cards of the world's 10th largest economy. The globalists would call this an abuse of power. Throughout history, global reserved currencies have risen and fallen, from the Greek drachma in the 5th century BC to the British pound sterling 1700s to 1931. Every single one has collapsed, and the resulting implosion of a reserve currency spreads like a tsunami, wrecking economies worldwide. Thus, it's only logical that a global central authority with no national loyalties be put in control of an international reserve currency, right? Maybe a multi-currency base basket system, or perhaps a single world currency, to prevent any future tragedies and abuses of power from ever happening again, right? Don't be fooled, it's a complete con. World war, whether economic or kinetic, and the death of the dollar as a global reserve currency is a perfect excuse for the perfectly rational introduction of an international financial oligarchy. And unlike its predecessors, this ruling council would operate right out of the sun, in the sun for everyone to see, not in the shadows deep in the bowels of central banking cartels. Their authority would be official and their control established as necessary, even vital for world peace. This is the same thing that has happened for every major war or world war. The argument is made that national sovereignty was the cause and that nation states should not exist, because when people are left to organize into groups, they might form different ideas on how to live, and different ideas cause conflict. After World War I, they introduced the League of Nations, After World War II, they established the UN and the IMF. And after economic World War III, they will try to implement a program of one world currency and global economic governance and dominance as well. Globalists claim it's better for there to be no sovereignty, no groups, and no differing ideas. They say we need one homogeneous global collective with a single hive mind, goes to the argument so that no conflicts ever happens. Of course, they get to have their own group, and that group intends to garner all the benefits of the crisis and the power that will be derived from the panic. I strongly recommend you prepare yourself and your family for the end of the US dollar's global reserve status. That means securing your financial future with what's been called money of last resort. In other words, physical gold and silver, physical precious metals safe from hacking, immune to the collapse of the electrical grid, and will very likely always be worth something, which is more than they can say for the vast majority of fallen currencies. They're a solid financial foundation to build your future on, whatever the future brings. Take yourself off the dollar standard before the globalists do it for you, because once they come for your dollars, it'll be too late. And with that warning, I leave you with a quote from the globalist and Council on Foreign Relations member Richard Gardner, published in Foreign Affairs magazine 1974, which I think drives home the reality of the people we are dealing with. In short, the house of world order will have to be built from the bottom up rather from the top down. It will look like a great booming, buzzing confusion, to use William James' famous description of reality, but an end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece, will accomplish much more than the old-fashioned frontal assault. The source is Birch Gold. This is on Humans Be Free. Please leave your comments. Thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.